Welcome to some more questions and answers here on the Old Front Line. These are questions submitted by you, the podcast listeners, and each month we select some of the best questions that have been submitted via email and the Discord server to answer here and hopefully give us all fresh perspectives and new knowledge of this vast subject of the Great War. So let's begin. This week's questions and answers focus around the subject of the commemoration of the dead and war cemeteries on that landscape of the Great War on the Western Front. And this is prompted by that recent episode on the newest First World War British and Commonwealth cemetery, the extension to Loos British Cemetery in northern France. That episode has proved incredibly popular and has generated a lot of interest, and we spoke about it as well on a recent podcast supporters evening. It's very much an ongoing subject, and we'll discover more as time goes on, as the Commonwealth War Graves Commission give us more information as to what the intention with that cemetery is, and we'll see where the dead are coming from that are going to be buried there and discover more of their stories. So the questions in this episode are partly a follow-up to that recent episode and some related questions on the commemoration of the fallen from the Great War. So let's jump straight in with our first question from Richard Tatterton on email. After listening to your pod on the Loos Cemetery, it got me thinking, if soldiers' remains are identified but they have their name on a memorial for the missing, what is the procedure in removing that name, as surely this would leave a void on the removal? Now that's an interesting question, Richard, because it's only ever been done once, to my knowledge, on a big scale, and that was in the 1990s on the Thiepval Memorial on the Somme, when a decision was made there to remove the names of those who had subsequently been found. Even when that memorial was unveiled in 1932, there were hundreds of men who had already been found since the process of compiling the names had begun and then the actual construction, building and engraving of the memorial took place. So it was kind of redundant, really, as a listing of the dead by the time it was built. And if you think of all the decades that followed, when human remains, soldiers' remains were found on those battlefields of the Somme, there were many occasions that during my 40-odd years of visiting the battlefields that I witnessed the recovery of soldiers and heard about the recovery of soldiers. So the names did change. And in the 90s, a decision was made, as we've said, to remove those names from the Thiepval Memorial of soldiers who had subsequently been found. So the only way to do this at that time, the blocks themselves are engraved, they're squares that are slotted into the memorial with the front facing listing the names. What they decided to do with Thiepval, as I understand it, was to literally leave those blocks in situ and then carve out the name of the soldier and soldiers who had been found, and that would then leave holes, shallow holes in the front facing of the memorial that would then require new Portland stone to fill them. And of course, when you did that, and this is what they found, is you filled a void that had been created by the removal of a name with a new piece of Portland stone, and it didn't match. The faded, weathered Portland stone that had been there since the construction of the memorial in the 1920s and 30s did not look the same as the new piece of Portland stone. So the removal of the names was something that was very, very obvious. And on some panels, there were whole sections where a list of names had been removed of men that had been found since the construction of the Thiepval Memorial. So it looked a little bit odd. And during the centenary renovations, an attempt was made to make that look less odd, I guess, by cleaning the stone and I think removing some of the blocks to have them re-engraved. And it looks a little bit better than it did, I think, in the 1990s. Now, to my knowledge, that hasn't been done anywhere else. There is a current process of renovation going on at the Menin Gate at Ypres, and I don't believe that they are going to do anything similar there. I could be wrong about that. The Commission don't always release this kind of information, understandably so, and I guess we'll have to wait until the memorial properly reopens next year. But the initial panels that I've seen that are accessible now, once the first phase of the renovation at the Menin Gate has been completed, don't seem to indicate that any names have been removed. For example, I looked at the Princess Patricia's Canadian Light Infantry panels to go and see the name of my old lodestar, my old friend, as he is to me, Talbot Papineau, whose life and death I've followed around those battlefields for so many years. And listed on that same panel are other Princess Patricia soldiers who I know have now been found and are in marked graves, but their names are still there. So that doesn't seem to have happened. Virtually, of course, the names are removed. So if you looked up, for example, John Kipling, the son of Rudyard Kipling, whose name is very firmly still on the Loos Memorial in northern France, you would discover that there is a grave for him now at St Mary's ADS Cemetery in the online database. And I remember back in the day, before these records were digitised, I was looking at some men of the London Regiment who are buried in Cabaret Rouge Cemetery at Souchez, close to Arras. They're all Loos casualties from September 1915. And when I looked up their names in the Commonwealth War Graves records, that was where they were buried. But then when I went to photograph the London Regiment panels of the Loos Memorial, I discovered that they were also commemorated on there. So this is something that's kind of been ongoing for a while, and there is no cross-reference showing that that particular grave is also a man that was once commemorated on a memorial to the missing. So in some respects, on one level, this whole process is kind of messy. I guess there will be a paper trail for the commemorations in the central Commonwealth War Graves record showing that at some point Soldier A was commemorated on this memorial, but in 1925 his body was found by a French farmer and he is now buried in this cemetery. But that you can't link that up yourself without your own kind of extensive research and discovering whether the names have been removed or not. And having said that there aren't any other memorials apart from Thiepval where the names have been removed, one monument to the missing that many don't even realise is a memorial to the missing, which is the Vimy Memorial, which commemorates more than 11,000 Canadian soldiers who fell in France from 1915 until the end of the war. It's not just a triumphant memorial to the capture of Vimy Ridge by the Canadian Corps in April 1917. It commemorates Canada's missing from France. They didn't exactly remove names from that. What they did when the memorial was renovated, again in that period leading up to the centenary of the First World War, they essentially started from scratch because there'd been a lot of degrading of the stone there. It sits in that very prominent exposed position and the stone had weathered away. It was discovered that a lot of names were not spelt correctly, so even men who did need to be on there, their names were not correct. There was information missing about them. And then, of course, just as with the other British memorials to the missing, many Canadians had been found. I'd researched quite a few of men killed at Courcelette whose remains had been found and are now in Adanac Cemetery or Regina Trench or Courcelette British Cemetery or other Somme cemeteries. So what they decided to do there was start completely from scratch to re-engrave the entire memorial. So what we see there today is basically Vimy Mark II. And that's kind of an extreme way of doing it. And I don't think that the Commission have plans to do that anywhere else. And in that case, I would guess financially, that kind of project was backed by the Canadian government to make sure that that memorial was right. So it's a fascinating subject. Soldiers are found, soldiers are recovered, and those men who will be identified through various processes and who will be subsequently buried in the new extension to Loos British Cemetery, the Canadians, they will be on that Vimy Memorial. Whether they'll remove their names from there, I don't know. The British soldiers will likely be on the Loos Memorial, and I don't think there's any plans to renovate that on any great scale or remove any names from there. And in some respects, does it really matter? Because it doesn't cost 1 penny more to have a man's name on a memorial as well as a marked grave. So it's an interesting subject, and thanks for that question. And I guess we'll kind of see how this develops in relation to this new cemetery. So let's move on to question number 2. And this comes from Philip on Discord. Following the Lewes Cemetery podcast, a question. DNA is taken with the idea of identifying the remains. Some remains are identified, some are not. How and when is it decided to bury the remains and to place a headstone? Is there a fixed waiting time between recovery and burial? How does this process go? Well, that's a good question, Philip. And I can't give you a definitive answer because over time processes have changed, particularly in the gathering and use and the methodology behind the use of DNA. But essentially what happens, as I understand it now, is that when soldiers' remains are found, sometimes there is limited information with that soldier to identify him. There's enough to indicate that he was a British and Commonwealth soldier by the military equipment that's with him, the fragments of uniform, boots and things like that, perhaps a steel helmet. But there isn't enough to identify him as a person. A regiment could be indicated, a nationality, Australian, Canadian, New Zealand, but not enough, again, to narrow that down to an individual soldier, because even on battlefields where a particular unit lost a certain number of men and only a proportion of that dead are missing, you've still got more than one possibility. So it's not a quick search to identify a soldier. And what DNA helps to do is to potentially match that sometime in the future with a living relative of that soldier. So DNA, there isn't a DNA database, and personally I don't think there should be. I mean, that's a discussion for another podcast maybe, but and certainly not this one. But in terms of the use of DNA, what it can be used for, and we saw this with the Pheasant Woods project at Fromelles, it was realised that the deads recovered there were from a specific time frame, from a specific battle, and from a specific nationality, in that case Australian. So an appeal was put out to the families of the missing Australian soldiers who died at Fromelles to step forward and to give their DNA to see if their DNA matched with any of the DNA taken from the soldiers' remains found in that grave. And some did. So some of those soldiers were brought out of the cold, given back their identity and buried as known servicemen in that brand new cemetery. And I think that is probably what is going to happen here with this new burial site at Lewes, because a big chunk of the initial graves that are going to come in to be buried in the cemetery are Canadians, men of the Canadian Corps who died in the Battle for Hill 70 in August 1917. So again, you have a parameter there. You have a time period, August 1917. You have a national parameter, in this case Canadian, and of course that can include British and other nationalities who emigrated to Canada, but it's a national force. It's a unit, coherent unit, and you can gather the information as to the names and the servicemen who died during that period and are missing. And then you can put an appeal out if you are the relative of a Canadian soldier who fell at Hill 70 in August 1917 and has no known grave. Please step forward and provide your DNA to see if any of that matches with the servicemen that have been found during this excavation at Lons. So that's kind of how it works. Now, before big projects like Pheasant Wood and this one at Lons, soldiers would be found on a regular basis. I don't believe for a long time that routinely they necessarily kept DNA samples. They may have done latterly, but I don't think they did 10 years ago, for example, because it was still quite a new process, and the Commission's purpose and work was perhaps different a decade ago to what it is today. It's evolved over time, given the constraints and funding, but also given circumstances to how particularly the battlefields of the First World War have evolved and changed, and there's been all this kind of development. So I don't think there's necessarily a list of soldiers who were found and who are buried in cemeteries as unknowns where the DNA is kept. And how would you start? I mean, if you found an unknown soldier in the middle of the Somme battlefield with no indication of unit, then how would you even begin to put out a call for relatives to step forward? I don't know how that would work. And again, it goes back to the fact that there isn't a DNA database, rightly so, for this to be compared to. So DNA is an incredible tool in the work that the teams who try to identify these soldiers, it's an incredible tool that they can use, but it's not a definitive tool. And it's not always a definitive answer if there is no match. And you've got to have living relatives to be able to provide DNA to make that match. And one of the things that we know when we study soldiers who fell in the Great War is that often they can be the last of their line. And there might not even be cousins to step forward or distant relatives to provide this kind of DNA sample that would be needed to make a match. But coming back to how long it takes, that's a very good question. And I don't think it's a quick process by any means, considering at the moment that they have a sizable number of human remains to examine. That in itself is probably a full-time job for a number of people, and they will be literally working on that as I record this podcast now. And even in the past, when human remains were found, then this would be a lengthy process. And I don't think there is a defined period between recovery of human remains, identification of human remains, and then looking at what possibilities there are to actually give that soldier a name. I don't think there's a clear pathway between any of those events and then eventually subsequent reburial. And I know that in some cases it has taken a year or more, in some cases several years, before a soldier is reburied under those kind of circumstances. And that is entirely understandable because no one wants to make any mistakes. Everyone wants to be sure that this is the right person and that this work is lengthy and needs to be lengthy to make sure that it is correct. So I think that probably there is a whole team of multinational members who are supporting the Commonwealth War Graves Commission, forensic experts, anthropologists, archaeologists, all these kind of people being brought together for this particularly big project revolving around the new Lewes British Cemetery extension. But the whole process of examining the dead, identifying the dead or not, will be a lengthy one and will take place over several years. And we will see this site evolve slowly but surely, and the identification of soldiers pretty much the same. And what happened at Pheasant Wood, and this is our kind of only parallel, I guess, in recent times, is that some Australians were buried as unknowns. Their DNA had been kept, and then later on, somebody who'd missed the initial call for relatives then stepped forward, gave their DNA, and it was a match to one of the ones that had been buried as an unknown Australian soldier. So we may see a similar thing happen with the burials at Lewes. But we've got to remember that DNA cannot identify everyone. The scale of loss, particularly in battles like Lewes in 1915, was so great, and there are so many missing on that memorial at Lewes. Over 20,000 names, of which probably nearly 2/3 are from the 1915 battle. The scale is too big for DNA alone to be able to identify these soldiers. So it's an ongoing process, but the most important thing is, identity or not, they're still honoured, and rightly so. Those unknown soldiers are treated in exactly the same exalted way that the unknown warrior who was once buried in Westminster Abbey was treated just after the Great War, and they are laid to rest with honour in new cemeteries or existing cemeteries on that landscape of the First World War. And that equality in death, whether identity or not, is to me a founding and core principle of what an organisation like the Commonwealth War Graves Commission should all be about. So those are our two Lewes-related questions, but the others are kind of related to the same subject. So if we move on to question 3, this comes from John Cashmere on email. This question has been brewing and formulating with me for some time. You discuss, talk, or refer to it on nearly every podcast, and I've been subconsciously wondering about it whilst listening or travelling around the battlefields. For example, Private Joe Bloggs was killed and is buried in a battlefield cemetery at XYZ. Cemetery XYZ was then closed and moved to a concentration cemetery at ABC. Or Private Joe Smith's remains were located on a farm and a farmer was ploughing his field around Pozieres, and those remains were exhumed and moved to another cemetery. A group of amateur battlefield archaeologists located the remains of a platoon who were then moved and relocated to XYZ cemetery. So I guess my question is, how do you close a cemetery? How do you actually move the remains from one cemetery to another? If they're buried at depth, do you take all the soil and remains? What happens to the old wooden cross or grave marker if they had one? After 100 plus years buried in the ground, surely there would be little remaining to move. Well, that's a very good question, John, and it's a question that I think evolves over time. If we were looking at the recovery of the dead in the 1920s, when soldiers were found during the post-war clear-ups or found by farmers in France and Belgium during their recovery of their land, and both of those obviously were very commonplace during that period, then people would go out and they would recover a more intact remains of a soldier who had fallen there. By that time, they would almost certainly be skeletal, depending on the circumstances of the soil. We know that the soil in Flanders can, particularly at depth, preserve human remains to a greater degree, and then in the chalk downlands of the Somme, that is less common. So then it would have been a far more straightforward proposition, as was the closing of a cemetery. And if we look at that, again, that landscape of Flanders, at the end of the First World War, there was something like 550 British and Commonwealth, British and Empire cemeteries across that landscape of Flanders fields. Too many to be preserved indefinitely, so the Imperial War Graves Commission made a decision to close the vast majority of them, and there would have been small burial grounds close to a trench system or a battlefield where there would have been a few dozen crosses, and the commission would go in and exhume those remains. Many of them would be wrapped in ground sheets or sandbag material, kind of Hessian material, and the exhumation would have been a bit more straightforward. There would have been remains underneath a cross where a cross was placed, in theory. They would have dug down, removed those, put them into a wooden box, and we've got photographic evidence of this, and then move them from that battlefield cemetery to whichever concentration cemetery they were going to go in. The wooden cross, the original wooden grave marker, would have accompanied them at that point because the permanent cemetery had not been made, and then it would have been placed on the new grave in that new concentration cemetery and would have remained there until the headstones were put in place in the 1920s and the cemetery was made permanent. Some families were able to get those crosses and take them home. An appeal was put out. I don't think they really advertised it to the degree that perhaps they should have done, because as I understand it, the cross would actually be posted to the family that would request it. And there are quite a few churches in Britain where you will see these grave markers that are hanging up in the church. There are family graves with them on. So some crosses did come back, but in the field, the vast majority of crosses were never sent home. What happened to them? Well, they were burnt. I spoke to Commonwealth Imperial War Graves Commission gardeners who were in retirement in the 1980s, some of whom had been tasked with the removal of crosses when the headstones were put in place, and they would pile them up and they would set fire to them and burn them. No one had claimed them. They were surplus to requirement, and these original grave markers were then destroyed. No doubt people listening to this, it will kind of leave us all really with kind of horror at this, but with hundreds of thousands of wooden crosses, what do you do with them in a period in which you're recovering from that war? In many ways, probably it was seen as another kind of burden. So that's what they did in the immediate post-war period. Today, 100 years on, all of that is very, very different. No wooden crosses are found today, and when human remains are discovered, it's either through accidents, when a tractor has ploughed up a bit of ground or an excavator has dug a ditch for a new pipeline or electrical cables or the foundations of a hangar or a barn or whatever it is. That is what has prompted the recovery of remains. Often they are fragmentary, they're not contained in anything. There is often very little with them to identify who they were. Sometimes, as we've said, regimental insignia that is in metal that survives. Occasionally soldiers have been found not with their original fibre tags. I only know of one soldier in recent years being found in the wet conditions of Flanders where a identity disc was found with that soldier's remains, I think tucked inside something else that had kind of preserved it. But some soldiers have been found with private purchase metal tags, or they were part of units that used metal tags. Some British units had a round aluminium disc that was worn. Many Canadians and Australians and New Zealanders had aluminium identity discs, and they tend to survive when others don't. So in that case, soldiers have been identified in that manner. But the remains are fragmentary, and they do remove as much as possible as part of the identification process. But without getting too grim, you're not looking at the remains of a soldier lying with his hands on his chest in repose. This is the brutal outcome of brutal industrial scale warfare, and all of the weapons, the cacophony of weapons that were available to both sides on the battlefield meant the destruction of humans was total in some respects. And I've seen this myself. Just walking across the landscape of the First World War, you find tiny, fragmentary remains of human beings, teeth, fragments of bone. And you can hand this in, and there are flower beds in some cemeteries where these fragmentary remains are quite rightly buried. But there isn't enough to identify really who that soldier was, or even what nationality that soldier was. But in terms of British and Commonwealth soldiers that are found, there is enough to identify that they are British and Commonwealth, and then the process begins after that. So in terms of moving an entire cemetery today, thankfully, that has never happened. No cemetery has been closed in recent times and moved. It nearly happened when I was living at Courcelette on the Somme. Back in the 90s, there was a plan to build a second Paris airport in the Santerre, east of Amiens. And that's that flat plain where the battles of August and September 1918 took place, involving British, Canadian, Australian soldiers, where the French army had been fighting for a big chunk of the early period of the First World War, where the March Offensive had swept through there in 1918. And a whole series of cemeteries were going to have to be closed if that airport was built, and the graves were going to have to be removed. How that would have been done, I really don't know, because if you ever had to close an existing cemetery now and exhume what was there, again, you would face the same kind of problems, particularly if it's a battlefield cemetery where the men are buried in trenches or shell holes. You're going to be looking at very fragmentary remains, not necessarily essentially complete bodies. But that's a proposition, the closure and removal and the movement of a cemetery, that I hope is never faced, never experienced by the Commonwealth War Graves Commission. To me, it would be a dreadful outcome to see a cemetery moved because of modern progress. So I hope that answers your question, John, and gives you a bit of context to the removal of graves. I mean, it is a very complex subject, and it is a subject that evolves over time as well when we look at the early movement of casualties through to what happens on the battlefields more than a century later. So let's move on to our fourth and final question, which comes from Jim Hastings on email. I really enjoyed the podcast looking at the 70th Brigade on the Somme yesterday, and it got me wondering. You mentioned that although many graves may be for an unknown soldier, there were some to an unknown soldier of the King's Own Yorkshire Line Infantry or an unknown corporal. Do you know if there are any separate records of these graves, for example, of unknown soldiers of the Northamptonshire Regiment or men from the Border Regiment in a particular cemetery? I recognise that with a consolidation post-war, it would skew the pattern, but such a record for cemeteries would also give a flavour of the fighting thereabouts and maybe link such men to particular actions. I have two cousins on my dad's side who were killed with the 6th and 7th Northants around Trones Wood and Guillemont, respectively, both on the Thiepval Memorial. But your comments got me thinking about searching the cemeteries around that area for unknown Northant soldiers within them, just out of interest. Well, Jim, there will be a record of these men. When you look at the original burial records that we can download for identified soldiers from the Commonwealth War Graves Commission online database, you can see that they are listed. But there is no way of searching those records for unknown. So you can't go on and say, give me a list of all the unknown Sussex soldiers that are buried in Cabaret Rouge, or in your case, all of the unknown Northamptonshires that are buried in the cemeteries around Trones Wood and Guillemont Road, and Bernafay Wood Cemetery and Delville Wood, and so on. What you have to do, and this is something that I've done myself over the years, is do on-the-ground research yourself. Go to these cemeteries, look for the types of graves that you're interested in your case Northamptonshire's, look amongst them for any identified soldiers, so you've kind of got a marker point then, which you can then look up on the War Graves database for that identified soldier, particularly if he's in the same battalion as the one that you're interested in, and it will show where he was moved in from, where he was consolidated in from. So that will give you a kind of a location, and if it's one of the battalions of the Northamptons that was in Trones Wood and he's from a field grave in Trones Wood, then obviously that's going to be the right area. And then if you look at the unknowns that are buried around him in the sheet that's online for him, which will show the graves that are immediately surrounding him, and they all come from the same place, then it's a fair chance that those unknowns are also from the same battalion, the same action, and obviously from the same original burial ground. And what it means is that you can start to look for the missing, to see where they are. There are so many unidentified soldiers in cemeteries, but they are partially identified in terms of regiments and ranks. And using that, you can then go through the records and find out a bit more about where they come from and to see if they link to what it is you are researching. I've done this with quite a few Royal Sussex actions, for example, over the years, and also with Canadians at Courcelette. In the three cemeteries that are there, Courcelette, British Cemetery, Regina Trench and Adanac, there are some very tempting unknown soldiers in terms of potentially identifying who they were. An unknown lieutenant of a particular Canadian battalion where he's in a plot of men killed on a particular day. And when you look at the records, there's only a couple of possibilities as to who that might be. And we've seen in recent years how teams of researchers have done just this kind of research, have seen graves as they've walked the cemeteries on the battlefields and thought, I wonder who that could be, and have done some research, have gathered the evidence, have submitted a case to the Commonwealth War Graves Commission, and headstones have been changed, have been rededicated, and the Commission have accepted that that grave, previously an unknown whatever it was, is actually an identified soldier, and you can clearly say who he was because the evidence is there. And I remember many years ago going with a friend of mine who was researching lads on his local war memorial, and he had a newspaper report saying that this particular soldier had been buried in a shell hole with Private X of this regiment and Private Y of that regiment, and the letter identified both of those soldiers. When he'd looked them all up, his man was buried at London Cemetery Extension at High Wood, and the other two were on the Chat Vale Memorial. But when we went there were three graves in a row next to each other, indicating they were all buried together, and the regiments on the unknowns either side of his identified soldier matched exactly the regiments in this newspaper report. So he submitted this evidence to the Commonwealth War Graves Commission with some further research, and they accepted it, and those two headstones were subsequently changed. Somewhere in the process, the names that had once been on the crosses that had been there had been lost or destroyed during the war, but now, after so many years, and that was back in the 90s, so that was in the kind of 80th anniversary period of the First World War, 8 decades later, they could be properly identified and their graves marked. So I guess with all of these questions this week, this is about the evolving nature of commemoration. So thanks to you all for these questions, and I hope this has kind of added a bit more to our wider knowledge of how commemoration continues to move forward, and how within it we are seeing the very epitome, really, of the turning of pages of history, and that they never stop turning. One of the essential fascinations, really, with the Great War. So keep the questions coming, and as usual, you can submit them via email or on the Discord server, and I'll see you next time for some more questions and answers.
You've been listening to an episode of The Old Front Line with me, military historian Paul Reed. You can follow me on Twitter at Somcor. You can follow the podcast at Old Frontline Pod. Check out the website at oldfrontline.co.uk, where you'll find lots of podcast extras and photographs and links to books that are mentioned in the podcast. And if you feel like supporting us, you can go to our Patreon page, patreon.com/oldfrontline, or support us on Buy Me a Coffee at buymeacoffee.com/oldfrontline. Links to all of these are on our website. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you again soon.